So as of this past weekend, we now know the identity of the shooter. His name is Tyler Robinson. And as far as the chart, we can only work with the birthday, and that we learned from a post that his mother made to Facebook a few years ago, celebrating his 15th birthday, from which you can then deduce that the birthday is April 16th, 2003. Of course, this goes to show you, number one, that he originates from a pretty obviously gun-toting, gun-promoting, gun-worshipping right-wing family that votes Republican and that supported Trump. And on top of that, you could also point to the pretty blatant hypocrisy these people tend to practice. They have these really strong, strident beliefs, but she tried to remove the post when she became aware of the trouble her son was in. And it's par for the course, that they have strong beliefs until they think maybe it's going to get them in trouble. But whatever the case may be, we look at his birthday chart shown here with the moon in the middle of Libra as the position for noon. It can be, though, from 17, almost 18 degrees Libra all the way to 3 degrees Scorpio. Statistically, more than 3/4 of the time it's going to be in Libra. He would have to be born post 7 p.m. or so to have the moon in Scorpio. But you can see that much like when we looked at Kirk's chart in a recent video and immediately could see the Mars, in fact, Mars traveling together with the black moon position in Libra, in Kirk's case, conjoining his sun degrees, being a super important player in this horrible event. In the case of Tyler Robinson, same thing. The Mars is in Libra, possibly conjoining that moon or not, depending on the degrees of the moon. But either way, it's going to be opposing the sun degrees and squaring itself, the Capricorn Mars. And separately, you see that the Saturn cycle, because Saturn is yet to finish with the Pisces degrees, which it's in now until February of next year, the way transits work, it crossed through the square to itself in Robinson's chart back in the late spring, went forward into Aries in the summer. Now it's going back and it's going to park in a station in November, very close to squaring it again. So Saturn is also involved in this situation in terms of propelling him into action. The Mars, though, is incredibly significant, especially on a flyby basis. And then you can also see that Uranus stationing this month is part of the drama because it's in a direct square to itself in his chart. And Uranus is notorious for that reckless, risk-taking kind of action, particularly when you start to look at this guy's chart and notice that he's born with not one, not two, three T-squares in the chart, covering the cardinal, fixed, and mutable modalities. The cardinal T-square is sun, moon, which, by the way, is a full moon. No matter what time he's born in, it's a full moon, which immediately heightens emotions. Yes, it does increase brightness and energy as well, but it's also more unstable. And especially when you put it in a square to Mars, Mars being the top of the T-square. And this kind of configuration seeks action. Aries itself is already a very action-oriented sign. You put it in this kind of formation, it's going to be extremely driven toward taking action on things. But then the second T-square is the fixed T-square, Mercury with a Neptune-Jupiter opposition, Mercury at the top of the T-square there. And you notice there is that much like if we look at the prior one and we see the Mars in Capricorn directly squaring Kirk's Sun Jupiter, you also notice that in this case with the fixed T-square, those planets do an attack on Kirk's Scorpio planets. So you have 2 points of disagreement there, of major challenge. And then the final T-square is Saturn opposite Pluto, square Venus, and that also links to Kirk's chart because there's a square there as well, even though there's a square from the Saturn to Kirk's Venus, even though, broadly speaking, it does trine Kirk's Saturn, so that there's a kind of broad agreement on some theme or other. They're both tilting right, but then the square to Venus brings in a clash of values. So you've got multiple points chart to chart that are challenging and dangerous and being currently activated in current times because, yes, of course, the Mars is the fast-moving influence. That's always a dangerous trigger. You see this again and again and again, and especially in violent situations or accidents, something martial, literally. But if you look at Robinson's chart, you notice that that cardinal T-square has been transited by Pluto in recent years. This, to me, would be the growing radicalization. Pluto is an energy that wants to make big changes to things, wants to destroy something and recreate it. And so, in this context, extremely dangerous because it's activating that cardinal T-square, and because Pluto comes from its own T-square, opposing Saturn and squaring Venus, Pluto opposite Saturn is one of the nastiest patterns in the sky that you can find. Pluto opposite Saturn or conjunct or square. Very dangerous. 9/11 happened on a Pluto opposite Saturn in the sky, cutting across the U.S. ascendant. I mean, really bad. And then in the mid-60s, all the difficulty in the mid-60s in this country with the Vietnam War and the conflict around the passage of civil rights, a lot of the murders that were going on. That was Saturn opposite Pluto back then, Virgo to Pisces, whereas at 9/11 it was Gemini to Sagittarius. So you've got a person with multiple T-squares wired into someone else's chart. And of course, the fact that he has these T-squares makes him potentially very unstable. Were he not in this way, were he somehow more balanced, somehow had found more balance in his life, then having more T-squares means you can accomplish more. Of course, that's theory. In practice, it's like having access to a wild horse that can throw you off and hurt you. And certainly now, particularly when you look at, if you focus on the cardinal T-square alone, you know that Saturn is going there over the next couple of years. His life is going to become quite hellish. The mutable T-square there, the Saturn parking on that Venus in November, in the near term, he's going to feel that, of course, as well. But bottom line, they're definitely linked. And if you want to add even more, in quotes, spooky energy, if you take the composite of these two charts, the composite is when you blend two charts. So you take the midpoint between each person's position of the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars. And of course, there again, the Moon becomes very uncertain because both moons are uncertain. So you can't really put much stock in that. But you notice that in that situation with their composite, the composite Sun, and what better description in a relationship between two people than going straight to the Sun, the biggest energy in the solar system, at 24 almost of Cancer, which Mars in its cycle in Libra was directly squaring it. And you notice that on the other side of that, in the composite, Saturn conjunct the black moon in Aries. So the composite itself has Saturn black moon square the sun. That's not a great alignment. That's a pretty perfect signature of tremendous disagreement. The Aries and going into violent energy is also a pretty good fit. And then you have the composite Venus at 26 Sagittarius. That's not finished with the Saturn action either. But the most notable here is the Sun squaring those planets in Aries, and the fact that it's being triggered at the moment by the moving Mars energy. So bottom line, the astrology makes perfect sense. Separately, and very unfortunately, the malevolent orangutan that at the moment leads this country, instead of bringing the country together in a situation like this, is determined to foment more division. And so we're in a pretty difficult moment. If you recall that video that I posted last week sometime, where I showed that Mars is traveling with the black moon, and there was a contact around the time of the shooting, but then there was another contact mid-month, which was yesterday, when all that horrible rhetoric was coming out of the White House around how they were going to look for all the left-wing people, organizations, you name it. This is really tragic because there's no proof of that. We'll have to see. The line right now is that apparently he had a roommate that is transgender, or possibly a lover that is transgender. And so that's the only transgender link that I've heard. Not sure where Trump's explanation that Tyler Robinson is a lefty, I'm not sure where that comes from. We'll have to see what his complaint was, if we ever learn about it. But the other crazy fact is that apparently, from what is known so far, if there's a role for the trans person, whoever they are, they apparently were helping the police. They were tipping them off. They were giving them information to help them, prosecute Tyler Robinson. So I don't know how all this comes together. I think we have to wait. There's a temptation to try to put together the story before all the facts are known. And of course, that's always nearly always a bad idea. But suffice it to say that, we're in a difficult zone. I've said this repeatedly, and by zone here, I mean years. This is the fact. This is the next octave, so to speak, of the 1860s Civil War. The country is completely at odds with itself. And of course, it doesn't help that in large measure it's because the people that are currently charged with the governance, currently charged with leading us, instead of bringing people together, they're hell-bent on fomenting division. And so it's like almost impossible for it to quiet down. However, even so, my suspicion is that where Mars is right now, traveling through the end stages of Libra, well, first of all, it's increasing the aggression and the malevolence and the combative nature of the Orange Menace, because of what it's doing to his chart, squaring his Saturn, Venus in the 12th house. But the black moon is involved because it's traveling with Mars. It's going to move, and of course gets into Scorpio. That should quiet things down. We also have the fact that the eclipse that is coming up is hyper-focusing things as well. The one that is due to happen on the 21st, with the sun and moon being in late Virgo and Saturn on the other end. So I would say we have to hang on until we get near the end of the month for things to start to become a little easier. And in the meantime, all we can do is continue to pay attention and try to remain as calm as possible. Don't just focus on the words that are being spoken by the GOP. Lots of threats, lots of projections. They act on some of them, and some of them they don't act on. And remember that overall, I continue to see this as a matter of waiting them out, because the more this astrological energy moves into the end of the year and next year, the more complicated it becomes for them from the top down. And I know, I've heard this many times, I know the comeback tends to be, yeah, but they are hell-bent on doing something to rig those 2026 elections. Here is where I beg to differ, and I'll continue to repeat this. You can attempt to do things, but your success is going to be measured by the astrology. And in this situation, the astrology trumps them. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you.